Giant Brian, one of the world's most infamous criminals, sentenced to 2 years for stealing a lifetime supply of Fredo Frogs from his local Tesco Express. He found himself in Centre Perks, an institution staffed by some of the best policemen and policewomen from across the globe. Some would say he deserved it, but in his opinion, people just didn't understand, and he wasn't gonna let society chain him up. No, he didn't play by the rules. Giant Brian was going to escape. Day 1, he woke up in his cell. Prison cell? More like prison hell, he thought to himself as he walked on over to roll call. Brian looked around at the other scum he had been dumped in with. There was no way he was staying here with this bunch of losers. It was humiliating. They even had a camera crew filming a documentary on this whole mess. He went over to the cafeteria to get his breakfast. Wait, hold on. Nobody tells the infamous Giant Brian when to eat his breakfast. Goodness, he had to escape this place straight away, and he made a dash for the nearest exit. Damn it, it seems they lock the doors in this place. Escaping prison might be a bit harder than he had first thought. He went and had a drum on the bongos to calm himself down. Feeling disappointed, Brian returned to the cafeteria where the other inmates were now having lunch. But his spirits were lifted when he went to open the cutlery drawer, and he found a whole bunch of plastic knives. The fools! They just leave weapons out in the open for anyone to take. Giant Brian was trained in all forms of combat, and with a plastic knife in hand, breaking out would be easy. He would just have to stab everyone, but then he saw that it was job time, and he had a change of heart. Wait, you can get a job in prison? This was perfect. He would just earn enough money to pay back Tesco for the Fredo Frogs he had stolen, and they would drop his charges and let him go, no questions asked. He headed over to the job centre full of anticipation. What job were they going to give him? But, oh, they didn't offer him anything. Perhaps he didn't seem very employable, or maybe it's because he was carrying a giant plastic knife during the interview. There must be some other way to make money, he thought. Maybe he could be the star of this prison documentary they were filming, or perhaps he would take this chance to get to know some of his fellow inmates. Whilst in the showers, he approached a young man named Bendrick. Bendrick said that another prisoner named Warmballs had stolen his screwdriver. And what's more, if Brian could get it back, he would pay him for the favour. Without hesitation, Brian went downstairs, found Warmball's desk, and peeked inside. But the screwdriver wasn't there. Thankfully, Warmballs himself passed by just a moment later, and, using his plastic knife, Brian beat him up and found the screwdriver in his pocket. Upon returning it to Bendrick, bang! Instant money. And with all these other prisoners about such as Rafflecopter, Gubbins, Codebreaker, Ron Johnson, and Judi Dench, Brian was about to be filthy rich. He went to bed that night dreaming of nothing but coins, and the next day he accepted a bunch more quests. Mr. Gears wanted him to get rid of a contraband magazine. Hey, no problem Mr. Gears, and he flushed it down the toilet. Codebreaker wanted Brian to flood Tony No-Nose's room. Hey, no problem, Codebreaker, and he flushed a bunch more things down the toilet. Wendy Nails wanted him to get rid of a paperclip for her. Hey, no problem, Wendy, you get the point by now, he flushed it down the toilet, but soon, Brian was practically made of money. All that was left was one final quest, and it was the most well-paid of them all. Tiny Tim wanted him to usurp Gubbins from her mail sorting job. Brian found out where Gubbins was working, but unfortunately, due to his unemployment, he was unable to get through the door. So, the next day he followed her around until she was all alone, beat her up with his plastic knife, then tied her up with duct tape and carried her away. It was all going so well until he reached the stairs, and he wasn't strong enough to carry her down them. Whilst he was searching for an alternative route, she regained consciousness and escaped his grasp. He then tried again by waiting outside of the mail sorting room, but before he could tie her up this time, a medic arrived and swept her away to the hospital. He then tried a third time, but in this case she was able to dodge past him. In all of the commotion, Officer Marmalade had got a bit confused, and she burst into the mailroom to knock Gubbins unconscious again. I'm a bit worried about Gubbins at this point actually, can we at least check for a concussion? Giant Brian was frustrated that the police had done his job for him, and he beat up Officer Marmalade, stole her keys, and went on a rampage. It wasn't much time before he was apprehended, however, and the prison was sent into lockdown. Two things were now clear to Brian. Number one, he had had enough with the goddamn feds always being on his case. And number two, he needed to get stronger. He trained and trained and trained until he was as strong as 4 men. Probably 5 if he'd remembered to eat his porridge in the prison cafeteria that morning. Now, all he needed was some tools. His plastic knife had served him well up until now, but if he was honest, he would rather use it to eat things with. He went into his crafting menu in search of a new weapon, but he had worked out so much that his brain had become incredibly small. He had to become smart, and for this, he needed to read. Okay, we can skip the training montage this time. Giant Brian was so educated now that even his fellow prison mate and famous diary author Samuel Pepys gave him the time of day. And, using his new intellect, he fashioned himself up— Excuse me, Ron Johnson, I'm actually in the middle of something here. Get out of here, Ron Johnson, get out! He fashioned himself some armor and a whip using duct tape, some wire, and a big stick. Now, it was showtime. His plan was to beat up every policeman in the whole prison. In fact, here was one now. Take this, Officer Templeton, take this, and then he was knocked unconscious and had to craft all of his items again. But this time, he was back with a vengeance. Officer Drainpipe was taken down in a second. He tried to tie her up, but she was carried away by the medic again. No matter, because Giant Brian was pumped up and he had a taste for blood. His next victim was Officer Todgers. Okay, I'll just put you there. And after that, it was Officer Bonser's turn to taste the crack of his whip. Then, it was Officer Whippet. Oh, sorry Samuel Pepys, you got caught in the crossfire a bit there. And finally, it was Officer. By this point, he'd damn near taken out every rozzer in this godforsaken institute. But hold on, what's this? Why is everyone getting back up? You were supposed to be defeated, you're supposed to be unconscious. Oh god, there's so many of them! Abort the mission! Retreat, Brian, run for your life! You would have thought at this point that Brian might have faced some sort of punishment. Maybe detained, maybe put in solitary confinement, but this is the first level of the game, and he was fine. Which meant it was time to go again, baby, let's go, Brian! This time, Brian couldn't be bothered to make a whip, so instead he just bonked the officers on the head with a big stick. Eventually, he did so much bonking that they began to set the dogs on him, and he knew now it was make or break. He grabbed whichever keys he could find and made a dash for the doors. Before he could make it too far though, the K9 squad was on his tail, and he fell victim to the Paw Patrol. Now, you might have thought at this point Brian would have faced some sort of punishment, maybe solitary confinement, but no, he was fine. And this of course meant he could go once again, baby. I feel like I'm repeating myself here. But let's be honest, bonking people wasn't getting him very far, and he didn't spend all of that time in the library for nothing. No. Now commenced Phase 2, also known as Strategic Bonking. You see, during his previous raid, Brian had come into possession of the red key, which was normally carried by Officer. He knew from his time spent searching the prison perimeter that there was in fact a red door, which, if opened, would place him only one fence away from total freedom. All he needed now was a pair of fence cutters, which he made out of 2 files and a roll of duct tape, and, scavenging a hammer from someone's desk, he was ready to bonk, but this time with purpose. Brian hunted down Officer and let her guard down by making small talk with her in the cafeteria. So, nice food they have in this place. He then followed her around and waited for the perfect opportunity to strike. Bam! A few hammer blows and Officer was toast. Brian picked her up, took her into the next room, and swiped the red key. It was now a race against time. He had to make it down to the red door before Officer was discovered. He sprinted down the hallway and outside, but hold on, what's that hit marker for? Oh my god, he was being shot! There was a sniper! Oh goodness, Brian, run! He got through the red door, pulled out the wire cutters, and just as he was about to escape... You would think at this point that Brian might receive some sort of punishment, and okay, this time he was put in solitary confinement. Well, I guess this is it, Brian. The end of the road. Nothing better to do now than spend the rest of your days peeling potatoes. He wished he still had his plastic knife so that peeling would be so much easier, but wait, that was it! Brian had been on the right track from the very beginning. Only he had picked the wrong type of plastic cutlery. A plastic knife was only good for stabbing people, whereas a plastic fork, well, a plastic fork could do anything. As soon as he was out of solitary confinement, he went to the cafeteria, stocked himself fully with plastic forks, and ran back to the perimeter. This time, he wouldn't escape through the fence, he would escape through the wall. For hours and hours he chiseled away at the concrete, taking away 1% of its durability each time, and Jesus, Brian, this is going to take forever. But Brian wasn't giving up that easy. He figured out that a crowbar is essentially just a metal version of a big plastic fork. And after beating up his fellow inmate, Mystic Meg, which took a couple of tries as she was surprisingly strong for an old woman, he stole all of her money and used it to buy a crowbar from Wendy Nails. Then he crafted a bed dummy so the cops wouldn't realise he was missing, and that night he snuck back out to the wall and tunneled his way through. It only took a few hits with the crowbar before the wall busted open and he ran outside. He could finally smell the sweet, sweet stench of freedom. He felt the wind blowing through his non-existent hair. But then, oh no! The camera crew who were filming a prison documentary had followed him outside, and they were giving away his position. He made a dash for it, but the cops were onto him. A whole group of Rozzers right on his tail. Would he make it? Would he escape? Or would he be arrested? Again. Giant Brian, one of the world's most notorious criminals. Sentenced to 4 years for stealing a lifetime supply of Fredo Frogs and a packet of Sour Patch Kids from his local Tesco Express. Having previously been locked up in Center Perks prison, he escaped by tunneling through the wall with a bunch of plastic forks. However, whilst rejoicing in his momentary freedom, he was tracked down by a camera crew filming a prison documentary, and, after a few days on the run, involving many visits to Tesco, the police finally caught up to him, and he was taken back into custody. Now, he found himself in much more intimidating surroundings. Rattlesnake Springs, a prison situated in the scorching hot desert of Skegness. Repeat offenders were sent here to suffer in the unrelenting heat, but for Giant Brian, even heat stroke and mild sunburn couldn't bring him down. No, he was going to escape. Day 1. Hip 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 hip. Brian woke up with the taste of sand in his mouth. He made his way across the arid prison yard and lined up for roll call. The first thing he noticed was just how few inmates this prison held. These really must be the toughest of tough criminals. He looked around to see infamous names such as Kidnapper Kenneth, the Number Taker, Monsieur Plop, and a woman simply called the Typhoon. Brian was well and truly intimidated. He didn't want to stick around these folks for too long, and the first order of business was to find himself a weapon. Thankfully, this didn't take long, as, with a quick trip to the kitchen, he found exactly what he was looking for. The cutlery drawer! With his very own giant plastic knife in hand, Brian set out to survey the rest of the prison grounds, and find some way to escape this arid hellhole. To begin with, Brian busted into each prison cell and began to raid everyone's desks. If he was going to get out of here, he needed all of the random garbage he could get his hands on. As he was doing this though, a guard spotted him and began to chase him, and oh god, he was being shot! He was being shot already! He looked around desperately for cover, but there was barely anywhere to hide apart from the cells he had just come from. Thank God his plastic knife-based combat was extra effective in small spaces, as he was used to fighting people in the Tesco's confectionery aisle. He was able to get the better of Officer 69 and alleviate the immediate danger. It was thanks to this chase and scuffle that Brian now realised something. The vast majority of Rattlesnake Springs prison was outside. They exercised outside, showered outside, even the prison cells were partially open to the air. This whole compound was a sniper's dream. It was going to be very difficult to do anything here in secret. For now, Brian decided to avoid further suspicion by pretending to be asleep. This didn't work, however, as moments later he was mauled by a guard dog, shot unconscious, and put into solitary confinement. Whilst peeling potatoes, Brian bemoaned his rotten luck. He needed to find some place only he knew about, somewhere hidden away. And once he was free from solitary, he set out in search of just that. The first place he thought to search was, oh god, what's that? What's going on now? They have metal detectors as well, what the heck is this place? Brian was swarmed immediately by officers on all sides. What followed was a chase scene of epic proportions. 4 policemen were hot on his tail, and he ran around the prison yard for what felt like hours. However, just as he was beginning to break away, he stumbled across a mysterious but promising looking room. It was only small, but perhaps this could be Brian's new base of operations. Oh wait, no, here they come again. Run, Brian, run! Brian was then shot unconscious and taken to hospital. Once the heat had finally died down, Brian headed back to the small room. It was the perfect location, but it was too risky to use this place right now, especially after being caught here moments ago. So the search for a new base of operations continued, long after curfew and into the night. Fortunately, staying out late had paid off, as Brian came upon an even more encouraging sight. A room with a ladder in the middle. This could only mean one thing, a tunnel out of this place. Brian couldn't believe his luck. All he had to do was prise open this door and, oh goodness, there was guards everywhere. He couldn't be spotted. After doubling around the building, Brian lifted the door again, and this time he wrenched it open, but oh, there was one major problem. How could Brian get through the door if he was the one holding it open? It seemed this room wasn't going to work after all, and Brian headed back to bed disappointed. Or he would have done had he not been spotted on the way back and shot by another sniper. Oh well, Brian, have fun in solitary confinement. Brian had had enough of this. He was fed up of being shot, and this time he would find a way out. Oh, some stairs. Brian didn't realize this prison had an upstairs. Wow, this was perfect. He could see across the whole compound from up here, and he went around scouting out everything from above until... Wait a minute, was that... No way! He could see outside of the prison. The path to freedom was right there in front of him, and, picking up a metal pole from a room off to the side, he ran back out and began to break down the wall. Ooh, careful now, Brian, don't get caught. But once the coast was clear again, Brian continued to chip away at the concrete. He was nearly there, just moments away from another masterful escape. The wall crumbled before him, and he sprang down onto the sand below. Brian sprinted into the desert as fast as his tiny pixel legs would carry him. One lone officer had spotted him and was hot on his heels, but thankfully, Brian managed to find a wild horse off screen, and the officer had to make a retreat. Unfortunately though, Brian didn't really know how to ride a horse, and although we can't be too sure what happened, somehow when Brian reappeared for a third time, the tables had turned. So Brian was apprehended, and he was arrested once more. Well, damn it. It seems that simply breaking through a wall in broad daylight wasn't exactly the best plan. If he was gonna sneak out of here, Brian would need to find some way less conspicuous. How about going down? The old-fashioned diggy hole method, a staple of prison breaks across the world, and Brian knew just where to do it. He ran once more straight to the kitchen's cutlery drawer, and this time gathered up as many plastic spoons as possible. Then he discreetly entered the small room he'd found earlier, and began to dig and dig and dig. This would be the greatest tunnel this prison had ever witnessed. But oh my goodness, Brian, this is gonna take forever. Maybe digging a whole tunnel with just plastic spoons would be a little too slow. And, in pursuit of a more industrial method of excavation, Brian headed to the library and began to read books such as How to Make a Bottomless Pit, Archaeology 101, and the History of Dwarves. Through this, he learned how to make his very own pickaxe. And, after trading a crowbar from an inmate named Susan Fraud, he combined it with some pieces of wood and a metric ton of duct tape. Now, Brian was ready to dig properly. That night, whilst roll call was going on, Brian headed back to the small room. Unfortunately, roll call happened right next to the room he was digging in, so he did have to walk past the entire prison staff with his pickaxe in hand. But luckily, somehow, nobody noticed. His new pickaxe was so efficient that, with only a few swings, he had busted a hole in the floor. Brian jumped in, and, to his utter surprise, he found there was already a huge tunnel just a few feet away. This prison must have been built on an old mine shaft. It was incredible news. Brian barely needed to dig at all. He tunneled his way as fast as possible towards the shaft, but there was some boxes in the way that he couldn't quite get past. Brian chose to dig around, but by the time he was through, his pickaxe had broken. So he had to go all the way back and do the whole process again, craft another pickaxe, walk very obviously back to his tunnel. To be honest, someone should have spotted him by now. But once he was back down in the cave, it was showtime. Brian tunneled his way through the walls of the mineshaft until he saw light coming from what seemed to be an exit. This was it! Freedom was just this way! He ran out into the desert once more, but as it turns out, if you walk across a prison yard holding a pickaxe enough times, the guards will probably figure out that you're escaping via the mineshaft. In desperation, Brian once again turned to the local population of wild horses, but still not knowing how to ride, he fell off his horse again and was apprehended. Well, that was it then. It was hopeless. Who knew that equestrian would be such an important skill for breaking out of prison? Brian was out of options. He had tried escaping downwards, but with no success. He had tried escaping upwards, but to no avail. Maybe he really was going to be stuck here forever. Whoa, wait. Hang on. That was another set of stairs. How many floors did this prison have? As it turned out, there was a whole section of the prison Brian hadn't even set foot in. It seems that he had lost faith too soon. Brian had not yet failed in any escape attempt, and he was sure he would find a route somewhere. The only problem now was that this new section was blocked off by a red staff door. The fools! Didn't they know there was no door that Giant Brian couldn't open? Well, apart from that one earlier, but that doesn't count. Brian had broken into Tesco so many times that to him, a mere staff door was nothing but child's play. He used some talcum powder and a tube of toothpaste to make a moldable putty. Then he melted a hair comb using a stolen lighter, and he now had all the components he needed to make a fake key. All he had to do was get his hands on the real red key for a few seconds, and he would have access to every red door in the prison. The question was, where was the red key, and who was carrying it? Could it be Officer Wednesday? Maybe Officer Vandalism? But neither of those seemed high profile enough. No, there was one officer Giant Brian had in mind. The chief guard of Rattlesnake Springs, Officer Tuesday. Brian had to wait until she was done conducting roll call, but afterwards he followed her until she was all alone, and with a quick 1-2 he began to beat her up. Oh dear though, it seemed Brian had been a bit too keen. Officer Merlin had overheard the sounds of their scuffle, and he rushed in to help. Brian was able to knock down Officer Tuesday, but seeing as he didn't have his giant plastic knife on him, 2 officers was too much to handle, and he as well was knocked unconscious. Fortunately, they had chosen to hospitalize both Brian and Officer Tuesday in adjacent beds, and all Brian had to do was wait outside the hospital and beat up Officer Tuesday before she could recover. Just as suspected, she was carrying the red key. Brian had to be fast. He thrust the key into the mold, then threw it on the ground and made a run for it. The prison went into immediate lockdown, but Brian avoided suspicion by hiding in a nearby filing cabinet. Once the heat had died down, he returned to his cell, and he now had a red key of his very own. There was no time to lose. Brian snuck back upstairs to the ominous red door, unlocked it, and began to explore the rest of the prison. There was so much back here. It was a maze of corridors, and Brian didn't know where to look first. Eventually, he came upon yet another set of stairs, and then, and you won't believe this, another set of stairs. The staircase opened out at the top of a tall tower, and what Brian found up here made his heart skip a beat. A long rope tied to a pole, and a sign which said escape. I need to craft a complete crossbow, thought Brian completely spontaneously, which does seem like a bit of a weirdly specific thought to have with no context, almost as if this were a scripted part of a video game or something, but trust me guys, Brian thinks in the fourth dimension, he just knows these things. And, diving into action for what he hopes would be the final time, Brian skips all the way back to his cell, made himself his very own crossbow out of various scraps of wood, and then zoomed his way back through the red door and up the numerous flights of stairs. He strung the rope up across the rooftops, and then, using his crossbow as a handle, he ziplined his way through the air and down into the conveniently placed prison stables below. He jumped on a horse for the third time, buckled his heels, and rode out towards his inevitable freedom. Unfortunately, Brian still didn't know how to ride a horse, and so the horse just kind of kept going and oh god, where was this horse taking him? Where was he going to end up? No, Brian, come back, no! Giant Brian. A man so impossible to tie down, his very existence prompted the invention of the handcuffs. Sentenced to 6 years for stealing a lifetime supply of Fredo Frogs, a packet of Sour Patch Kids, and a bag of Quavers from his local Tesco Express, Brian had spent the past few months riding on the back of a horse because he didn't know how to get off. Ever since his miraculous escape from Rattlesnake Springs prison, the police had been hunting him incessantly. As a result, Brian had eventually been caught, and he now found himself facing a stint in his toughest prison yet, HMP Offshore. Constructed from the skeleton of a disused oil rig, as its name implied, HMP Offshore was situated in the middle of the sea. This meant, even if Brian was to escape, he would still be in the middle of the sea. Quite the conundrum, but as Brian always said, the impossible always becomes possible as soon as you remove the im part. Whatever that means. The point was, Brian was going to escape. Day 1. Brian woke up with the smell of seaweed in his beard and the taste of salt on his lips. As was second nature to him at this point, he headed on over to roll call and introduced himself to his new inmates. These were a gang of washed-up criminals, sent to rot out here in the ocean where nobody would have to see them. Names from a bygone era such as Don Krieg, Spooky Spoon, and Mrs. Tuppence. Brian didn't want to become just another forgotten name. He was Giant Brian, the world's greatest escape artist, and this was certainly yet another place he had to get out of. With this, Brian got to work. His first move was to head to the canteen to obtain his favourite prison weapon, a giant plastic knife. Wait, what the hell? No plastic knives? You have to be kidding me, thought Brian. They knew him all too well. Brian felt sick to his stomach. No giant plastic knives. How was he ever going to escape now? He headed outside to get some fresh air. And, after a brief walk around the prison grounds, he noticed something that made him feel a little better. As he looked down at the waves below, Brian saw that a huge pier extended in a big square around the lower levels of the oil rig. If he was going to escape from anywhere, it was sure to be down there. However, similar to his experience at Rattlesnake Springs, this huge area was off limits, separated from the rest of the prison by a red staff door. The fools! One of Brian's favourite hobbies was breaking through restricted access doors. Whenever he visited Tesco, for example, he would always make a point of using the disabled toilets instead of the normal ones. Brian knew from experience that to get through a red door, you needed a red key. But where in the middle of the ocean was he going to find one of those? The answer presented itself almost instantly, as his arch nemesis, Officer, walked past him and through the door. He should have known Officer would be here, but this was perfect. All Brian had to do was beat her up, steal her key, and make one of his own. He headed back to his cell and crafted a moldable putty using some talcum powder and a tube of toothpaste. Now to hunt down Officer, but hold on just a second, she was right here. Brian chose to strike while the iron was hot, and he began to feed Officer the sweet taste of his fists. Unfortunately, without his giant plastic knife, Brian wasn't nearly as effective in hand-to-hand combat. Officer knocked him unconscious, and he was taken to hospital. Without a weapon, this wasn't going to be easy. So Brian decided to hit the gym, as if he worked out enough, perhaps his biceps could become like weapons. After curling iron for several hours, he went and found Officer again and prepared to pummel her into the ground. But once again, she was too strong for him, especially once she was joined by Officer I Barely Know Her. In desperation, Brian searched around infamous criminal Spooky Spoon's desk for anything he could use to arm himself. A bar of soap and a sock. Hang on, if he put the bar of soap inside of the sock, he could make his very own sock mace. It was genius! With his new sock mace in hand, Brian waited around until after the next roll call, and ambushed Officer when she least expected it. Unfortunately, Brian had chosen the worst place for an ambush, as he was immediately tracked down by a sniper scope. Not wanting to be shot, he was forced to retreat inside of the shower block. But in this confined space, Brian had the advantage, and he was able to bash Officer right on the head with his bar of soap. There it was. Officer was carrying the red key, and also some sort of worm. I don't know what that is, but Brian took it anyway. He shoved the key into a mold and then made a break for it. But there was one problem. He couldn't go back outside without being shot. With only moments of time before other officers inevitably arrived, Brian was stuck in the bathrooms. He decided to have a shower to calm down. Brian's only option was to play it cool, just sit down in a chair and act as if nothing was out of the ordinary. But before he could do so, he was caught by the metal detectors and he had to shove himself inside of a locker just as the cops arrived. Phew, that was a close shave. But Brian had been successful. He headed to his room and he now had his very own red key. There was no time to waste. He made his way back to the red staff door, passed through it, and walked out onto the extensive platforms below. The series of piers and walkways seemed to go on forever. Brian passed by some sort of waste disposal area, then some type of submarine suspended above the ocean, and finally... a boat! Brian's heart skipped a beat. This was his ticket to freedom. All he had to do was get past this one simple fence, but ow! What? What was up with this fence? Ow! It was at this moment that Brian remembered electricity exists. In frustration, he tried to find some way around, but instead he bumped into a dolphin named Snooty, who was employed here as the prison's swimming instructor. Brian didn't have time to consider how strange it was that a dolphin was holding down a 9-to-5 job, so for now he accepted it at face value. Anyway, it was no use. It seemed if he wanted to reach that boat, he was going to have to try and brute force it. Ow, 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 ow. It didn't work. Well, that was that then. Perhaps Brian had rolled the dice one too many times. His luck had finally run out, and if he was going to spend the rest of his days trapped out here at sea, he might as well enjoy himself. Yes, Brian had decided that instead of wasting his time trying to escape on a boat he couldn't reach, he was going to waste his time fishing instead. A nice relaxing hobby that was much better for his general health. Brian visited the library and sat down with a magazine known as Carp Monthly. In this magazine were many incredibly interesting facts about carp, but it also detailed how to make a fishing rod. Brian set out to gather up the materials. First, he bleached his prison uniform and disguised himself as a nurse so he could sneak into the back rooms of the prison hospital and steal a piece of string. Then he combined the string with a stick and a paper clip, and all of a sudden, he had a fishing rod. Now all he needed was a bit of bait, but thankfully, he still had the worm he'd stolen from Officer earlier. And, just like that, it was time to get fishing. Brian headed back down through the red door to the lower levels of the prison. He searched around for a little while until he found the perfect fishing spot. He knew it was the perfect fishing spot as there was a big sign above it that said "Start Fishing." That he did. And, would you believe it, within mere seconds, he had reeled in his very first catch. But he didn't stop there. Moments later, he had caught another fish, and then another. This was such fun. Maybe life out here at sea wasn't going to be so bad. In fact, fishing had put him in such a good mood that he decided to give one of his fish to Snooty the dolphin. And it was while he was doing this that something unexpected happened. Snooty began to talk. Of course, she was speaking in Dolphin, and Brian couldn't understand a word she was saying. But whatever it was must have been really important, as everything Snooty was saying ended in an exclamation mark. Brian had to find a way to understand her. Maybe another read of Carp Monthly would reveal some answers. But, as he was passing through the cafeteria on his way back to the library, he was called over by an inmate named Bob Cratchit. Bob was a fellow fisherman, and he was hoping that he and Brian could do a fisherman's trade. If Brian gave him his copy of Carp Monthly, he would tell him where to find his favourite book, How to Speak to Dolphins. Wow, what a crazy and not set up coincidence, thanks Bob. Brian accepted the deal, and with How to Speak to Dolphins in hand, he opened his journal and began to decode all of Snooty the Dolphin's clicks and squeaks. If Brian was translating correctly, it seemed that Snooty had been asking him to bake her a cake. Well, Brian didn't have anything else going on, and he did have the majority of his 6-year prison sentence to sit through, so why not? He went around other people's desks and stole some sugar, some milk, and some flour, then crafting them together into a lovely cake. Of course, he'd forgotten to include eggs, butter, self-raising flour, baking soda, and much more, but it was probably fine. The next day, Brian was so excited to give his cake to his new aquatic best friend. He headed back down to the water's edge, gave Snooty her present, and then the most amazing thing happened. In return for his generosity, Snooty offered to help Brian escape. Brian was overcome with joy. Tears began to stream down his face, which you can't quite see in this pixel representation of events, but just trust me, they did. He jumped on Snooty's back, and she swam out into the great blue beyond. Brian had done it. He was free once again. Unfortunately though, Brian didn't know how to ride a dolphin, and a few seconds later, he fell into the sea. Snooty had to rescue him from drowning. It was back to square one again. Brian stood there soaking wet and feeling ashamed. "Sorry, Snooty," he said. "It was worth a try." Why was he so bad at this? Brian was supposed to be the world's greatest escapist, but when he thought about it, he was nothing more than a lucky fraud. All of his previous escapes had relied on great amounts of fortune. He wasn't a wonderful escapist. He couldn't even ride on the back of a dolphin without falling off. He was rubbish. He was trash. Wait a minute, that was it! If this prison was in the middle of the ocean, then how did they dispose of all of their trash? It had to go somewhere, and if Brian remembered correctly, he had passed by a waste disposal unit just a few days ago. The cogs in his brain suddenly hitting peak performance, Brian gave an emotional farewell to Snooty and launched into action straight away. It was all so clear now. Why had he ever doubted himself? Brian was the greatest escape artist in the world, goddammit! And he was back in the game. He grabbed the nearest metal pole he could find, then changed back into his nurse's uniform and discreetly headed through the red door towards the site of the garbage disposal. Brian began to chip his way through the wall, and he was on such good form that once he had broken through, he rebuilt the wall behind him again. It was time to scout out the area and plan his escape. I need to place a breathable trash bag here, thought Brian completely spontaneously. Yet another example of why he was the quickest mind in the criminal world. Brian went back upstairs and made a breathing mask using some duct tape and a plastic tube. Then, he poked it through a trash bag he had found and fashioned it into a kind of snorkel. So long and good riddance, HMP Offshore, he thought as he ran down the stairs with glee. This was it. He shoved the bag into the waste funnel, then jumped inside and waited. The prison guards were none the wiser. Brian had found a way to get on his boat. Where he would end up, even he didn't know. Probably a landfill, but one thing was for certain. Brian was a free man, and this time he would never be caught again. Giant Brian, a criminal so difficult to track down that his wanted posters feature only the very top of his bold, shiny head. Sentenced to 10 years for stealing a lifetime supply of Fredo Frogs, a packet of Sour Patch Kids, a bag of Quavers, and a box of potato waffles from his local Tesco Express, Brian had recently been shipped out to HMP Offshore, a prison situated on a disused oil rig in the middle of some unspecified ocean. After messing about with a dolphin for a few days, Brian eventually escaped, disguising himself as a bin bag and sneaking his way onto the garbage disposal boat. However, due to the bad smell of his surroundings, Brian began to make sounds such as "Fwah," and "Ooh, it smells horrible in here." As a result, he was eventually found by the police and recaptured. With the boat now sailing back towards HMP Offshore Prison, Brian had only a few hours before he would be shackled up for good. But with no intention of playing by the rules, he was far from giving up. No, as always, Brian was going to escape. Ah, what a peaceful snooze. The sounds of the ocean, the gentle rocking of the boat. But no! Wake up, Brian! You don't have time for this! He was trapped in a small cell on the starboard side of the deck. This wasn't good. No windows, no weak spots. How on earth would he break out of here? But oh, it seems they had forgotten to lock the front door. Well, Brian wasn't complaining, and he began to explore his surroundings. It didn't take much time, however, before he ran into trouble. He was on a reasonably small boat after all, and it was packed with officers. This might just be his toughest escape yet. He shook off the initial heat by hiding inside of a filing cabinet. But it was down here, in the bowels of the ship, that he stumbled upon his potential ticket to freedom. An old, broken jet ski. He had heard about these things from a Wii game called Dennis Sports Resort. If Brian could fix this battered machine, there would be no catching him. And so, he decided to scavenge the boat for spare parts. Well, he would have done if Officer Duct Tape hadn't been waiting for him outside the doors. Brian attempted to bash his head with a big stick, but the officer was too tough, and he was knocked unconscious. Waking up in his cell again, Brian wondered how much time had slipped away. Thankfully, there was a conveniently placed bar at the side of the screen. Still a couple of hours to go. No need to panic. But if he was going to navigate this ship in search of a jet ski repair kit, Brian would need a way to travel undetected. He would have to find a disguise. And in a boat full of police officers, what better way to disguise himself than to steal a police uniform? With his new plan in mind, Brian headed back upstairs. Perfect. Officer Spoon was wandering around outside on his own. With his target in sight, Brian made his move, and he hit Officer Spoon with some quick-fire punches, but oh, that didn't really go as well as he thought it would. Oh well, just a minor blooper, nothing to get too caught up about. How about this officer? Surely this time he could... Okay, what the heck? Was this boat just full of professional MMA fighters or something? I thought this was supposed to be a garbage disposal ship. The truth was, the bin men of HMP Offshore were in fact the toughest, most hardened officers of all. And it made sense. You sail a ship of rotten food across the ocean, and you have to be trained to fight off sharks, killer whales, and even a couple of krakens or two. Brian tried to steal a uniform again, but with no luck. He was too vulnerable, and with the time ticking down to nearly half, he was going to have to pull out his special move. He called it the Cranium Shield. Raising both arms as high as possible, he protected his face and left only the top of his bald head exposed. For context, the top of Brian's skull was so tough that it took over a minute to mine it with a diamond pickaxe. With this new technique, the police couldn't inflict any damage on him, and in no time at all, he had stolen a uniform and changed into a devious disguise. Now that he was undercover, Brian was able to search the boat with total freedom, and rummaging through various chests and boxes, he managed to find a couple of bolts and a piece of rubber tubing. This was all a genius such as Brian needed. Nobody knows what he did with those bolts and tubes, but as if by magic, the jet ski was fixed. He pushed it out the back of the ship and zoomed away across the ocean blue. Brian skipped over the waves until he found the shore. He was certain the garbage disposal boat would not be far behind, and so it was to his great delight that he found he had pulled up on the beach right next to an airport. All he had to do was buy a ticket to some far-off place, check in, and spend the rest of his days living a sheltered life on some tropical island. It was the best he could possibly have wished for. His plane seat even got upgraded to business class. You couldn't write this stuff. He had his own bed and everything and... Wait a minute. This wasn't business class. This was another prison cell. Oh, for goodness sake. Brian hadn't stumbled across an airport. He'd walked straight into a military airbase and got on a police aircraft back to prison. The time before he was locked up for good was once again ticking away. Well then, I guess play the escape music. It was time to break out once more. As before, this craft was packed with officers, and Brian was immediately spotted leaving his cell and chased down. He tried pretending to be just a normal passenger by sitting in one of the aisle seats. Unsurprisingly, this didn't work, and he was even less convincing role-playing as one of the pilots. Time to get himself another police uniform. It took a few tries, but with a combination of the cranium shield technique and a few of Brian's signature punches, he was able to take out Officer Albatross, and he now had free roam of the aircraft. Being the incredible escapist he was, Brian was able to sniff out multiple escape routes in just a few moments. For example, he could just open these doors here and jump out of the plane. Although he wasn't too sure about the survival chances on that one, so maybe he could try take over the controls of the plane instead, then fly himself as far away as possible. But these controls looked really complicated. Giant Brian's brain was giant, but not that giant. The third option was found down in the aircraft's baggage hold, in the form of a large inflatable dinghy. The only problem was, it wasn't inflated. Oh dear, it seemed Brian really was going to have to just jump out of a moving plane. Before he plummeted to his inevitable death, however, he thought it was probably best to at least try and find some equipment to make some form of parachute. Searching every nook and cranny, Brian was able to gather up just enough rope to fashion into some sort of makeshift harness. Lord above, Brian hoped these bedsheets were made out of nylon, as he tied his duvet up at the ends, strapped himself in, and then walked over to the aircraft doors. Brian closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and in a split second, he was gone. I'm just kidding, it had worked! Brian's homemade parachute had worked. He was gliding gracefully through the air and down towards the hallowed turf beneath. As the ground got closer, however, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. A long line of train tracks split the fields below him, and, chuntering along them, was a steam train. If Brian could get on that train, he would be heading far, far away from his pursuers at hundreds of miles an hour. It was an opportunity he couldn't miss, and, in a maneuver only a man of his skill could pull off, Brian soared through the air and landed himself perfectly inside one of the train's carriages. He was away! This time they would never catch him, but... Oh, hang on. Oh my god, you have to be kidding me. What were the chances of this? This was no ordinary train. This was a police train. It was far too convenient. Brian had to be the subject of some sort of sick and twisted prank. He'd gone from police boat to police plane and now to police train. What was going on? But as he stepped out of the carriage and into the desert sun, all of his questions were answered, as his arch nemesis, Officer, stood before him. It was all a stitch-up. Brian was never free from the very start. Officer must have orchestrated the whole thing. His head felt like it would explode. In a panic, he turned and ran. He didn't know what was real and what was fake anymore. As they barreled through the train cars, Brian attempted yet again to use the top of his head as a shield. But Officer was no mere policewoman. She was on a whole nother level, and Brian was knocked unconscious. Just before he passed out though, Brian noticed another presence in his midst. A horse was running at breakneck speed alongside the train. What was going on? Why was this pony in such a state? Probably just another one of Officer's elaborate schemes, thought Brian. But then he realized something. This was his horse, his faithful companion that helped him escape from Rattlesnake Springs all that time ago. Brian might not be able to trust in trains or planes or boats, But that horse had always stayed true to him, and here he was yet again, helping him in his hour of need. There was still hope. Sure, they were on their way back to prison for the third time today, but before that timer ran out, Brian was going to do what he always did. He was going to escape. Taking a baton from a nearby chest, Brian caught Officer by surprise and stole her uniform. He then travelled the length of the train searching desperately for any way he could gain the advantage. He picked up several crowbars along the way until he found himself in the very final coach, where he came across an orange pen and a green pen. To any dumb schmuck on the street, these would appear useless, but not to a genius like Brian. Without a second thought, he scrumpled a tissue from within his pocket into a cone shape, then colouring it in using the pens to create a fake carrot. Before he could leave though, he came face to face once again with Officer. She pretended not to recognise him through his disguise, but Brian knew that he didn't have her fooled, mostly because it was her clothes he was wearing. Instead of chasing him this time, however, they stood for a moment and stared off into the distance. "A storm's brewing," said Officer in an ominous tone. It was a statement meant to intimidate him, but he wasn't scared. She was right, a storm was brewing, and that storm's name was Giant Brian. Returning to his equine friend, he dangled the fake carrot out of the side of the train, waited for the horse to catch up, and then jumped on. "Run, horsey, run as fast as your little hooves can carry you." Unfortunately, Brian didn't know how to ride a horse, but it was okay, for he knew this by now, and he had a plan. Before the horse could take him too far, Brian leapt off its back and onto the roof of the train. Then, he combined the crowbars he had picked up earlier into a rudimentary grappling hook. And, with a triumphant swing, he latched around a station post and flew backwards into the desert. As the train swept away into the distance, Brian felt a great sense of triumph. Sure, he was in the middle of a desert with no idea where he was, but he had managed to one-up Officer for the final time, and he would never have to see her face again. Ooh! And then, everything went dark. Brian awoke with his body paralysed. He couldn't see. Something was on his face. "Latest test subject?" he heard someone say. Oh God, what was going on? Where was he? Who were these people? Brian was in trouble. Having broken out of prison 3 times already, he once again woke up in a small dark cell. But this time, it was no ordinary prison. Brian had been sanctioned to Area 17, a secret underground government facility where mad scientists performed all manner of unspeakable research. Those who ended up here were never heard of again. But Brian was built different. He was going to escape. Well, he would have done if only he could take this stupid mask off. What was the point in escaping prison if you couldn't look good while doing it, thought Brian. Ah well, at least as he headed out to roll call, everybody else in here was wearing silly masks as well, only, hang on, there was something familiar about these people. Mystic Meg, Don Krieg, Wendy Nails. He had heard these names before. They were inmates from his previous prisons. What were they doing here? But upon turning around, it all began to make sense. His arch nemesis, Officer, was standing behind a thick pane of glass. So that's what this was about. Officer had gathered up all of the most infamous criminals to use in her sick and twisted experiments. Brian felt uneasy, so he made his way to the cafeteria and got himself a giant plastic knife for protection. With the knife in hand, he felt confident enough to explore his surroundings. There had to be an escape route somewhere around here. But as he surveyed the rest of the building, his stomach dropped. The whole perimeter was fenced in, locked up by a series of red staff doors. Brian was no stranger to busting through a door or two, but he'd never come across this many before. He continued to investigate, but all he could find was some kind of film studio. Well, guess the moon landings weren't real. Turns out they were just filmed in the Nintendo Switch version of the game Escapists too. Okay, so no obvious way out. But at the very least there had to be some sort of escape tools or something. Oh. He didn't want to imagine what people had been using that for. Brian shut his desk in disgust, but he was so strong, he accidentally picked it up instead. And when he put it back down beneath him, he stumbled upon something very intriguing. An air conditioning vent stretched across the ceiling and outside of the fence. This was it, the opening he'd been searching for. Taking a screwdriver from a room nearby, Brian unfastened each corner of the grill and snuck inside. But he wasn't quick enough. He was caught in the act, and the prison was sent into lockdown. Brian had to move fast. He dropped down the other side of the vent and began to run around desperately. But at every turn, he was met with nothing except more red doors. Perhaps downstairs would produce better results. Wait a minute, what on earth is that? Ew, it was rancid. What a weird creature. This place was far more sinister than he could ever have imagined. And, to top it all off, as he staggered out into the prison courtyard, he gazed in awe upon what seemed to be a giant UFO. So this is what the government had been hiding. Aliens. Real aliens. Brian was freaked out. He wanted nothing to do with it, and he made to leave immediately. But before he could, a police dog came out of nowhere, and he was hunted down. It was no good. The hounds had sniffed him out, and in a whirlwind of snarling jaws, he was knocked unconscious. Well, that was an experience, but thanks to that whole ordeal, one thing was for certain. Brian was going to need to get his hands on a red key. The main problem with this was he had no idea which officer might be carrying one, so finding a red key would take some trial and error. His first target was Officer Punisher. Punisher? I barely know her, thought Brian as he beat Officer Punisher to a pulp. He was carrying the cyan key, which, as Brian knew, was not red. God, he was clever. He then spent a day in solitary confinement for attacking a police officer. Once he was out though, he found his next target, Officer Fister. Fister? I barely know her, said Brian, and it was even funnier the second time. Unfortunately, Brian was so busy laughing at his own joke that he forgot to fight back, and Officer Fister was able to knock him out. Thankfully, during his trip to the hospital, he bumped into his next target, Officer Saucer. Saucer? I barely know her. Okay, Brian, we get the point by now. And more importantly, there it was, the elusive red key, in the possession of Officer Saucer. Brian headed back to his room immediately to gather materials. He combined talcum powder and toothpaste to make a moldable putty. Then he melted a toothbrush to make some molten plastic, and with that, the mission was on. Tracking down Officer Saucer again, he began to bombard him with his signature punches. In no time at all, the policeman was out cold. Brian took the key, but before he could make a duplicate, backup had arrived. He was chased across the entire prison, until, eventually, even Officer joined the fray. He was getting away, until he ran straight into a riot policeman and was knocked unconscious. Attempt number 2. This time, Brian decided to change tactics and bring the alien probe with him. Not for anything nefarious, just to use as a weapon, and it's a good job he did too, because Brian was able to take out Officer Saucer with great speed and craft a spare key before anyone could realise. With the red key now in his possession, it was time to move the escape plan into Phase 2. Unfortunately, Phase 2 did require about 48 hours solid worth of looting, and the longest Brian had ever stolen things before was about 24 hours back in the days when he was just a young whippersnapper. So all of this material gathering was really exhausting. He even took the trouble to beat up Officer Punisher and steal the cyan key so he could break into his secret maintenance room and acquire a spade. Despite this monumental amount of theft, Brian managed to conserve just enough energy to craft himself a pickaxe, a pair of fence cutters, a sturdy shovel, a contraband pouch, and he even got a little bit art and craftsy as he combined toilet paper with glue to make papier-mâché, then moulding it into some fake vent covers. And finally, after all the preparation, Brian stocked up, changed into a guard uniform he'd stolen from Officer Saucer earlier, and the escape commenced. As the officers called for lights out, Brian hoisted himself cautiously through the ventilation shaft and down to the other side. He snuck his way downstairs, past the weird alien test tube baby, and along the corridor all the way to the very bottom of the prison. He was so close now, all he had to do was pull out his fence cutters and snip his way through here and— Ow! Ow! Oh no, the fence was electric, and these were metal fence cutters. Brian rushed back inside. If he remembered correctly, there was a generator somewhere around here. Aha! There it was! He pulled the lever, and the whole prison powered down. This was now make or break. It would only be a few minutes until every guard in the whole penitentiary was on his case. He chopped away at the fence with all his might, then dashed through, and began to swing his pickaxe wildly at the outer wall. 60%, 40%, 20%, the wall crumbled before him. He was out. He was really out, and he sprinted into the desert as fast as his little legs would carry him. Officer was in hot pursuit, but she wouldn't catch him. Giant Brian was far too quick until... Wait, what is that? What is that? Oh god, the UFO was here, and it was beaming him up. No! Brian stood there in a state of disbelief. Just a split second ago, he was practically home free, and now, here he was, back in this miserable prison cell. So that's how it was, eh? Officer was using alien technology to catch criminals, and he had been chosen, along with these other legendary bad guys, to be one of her guinea pigs. Well, Brian wasn't having it. Officer could do all the fancy schmancy science experiments she wanted, but nobody could chain him up. Not with handcuffs, not with, chains, I suppose, and not even with alien spaceships. He was going to take her grand scheme and use it against her. Brian was gonna steal that UFO. Hurling into action, Brian's first move was to secure parts from the lunar lander he'd found earlier. This way, he could use them to hot rod the UFO. To reach it, he would need to get through another red staff door. But that was weird. His red key wasn't working. I need the right keycard, thought Brian. He truly was a genius. And, after a couple more tussles with various police officers, he found the keycard in the possession of Officer I Barely Know Her. Creating a copy using a spare circuit board, he headed back to the moon room. Now he could open the door no problem, but there was still one major issue. If Brian was stood there keeping the door open, then who was going to go through it? This was bad news. A worst case scenario, in fact. Oh, crumbs. Brian was going to have to get himself a sidekick. He wasn't happy about this at all. Giant Brian was famous for working alone. Because of this, he decided to settle for the very first person he bumped into. Okay, who was this? Don Krieg. Yeah, I suppose he would do. Brian informed his fellow inmate of his masterful plan. But as it turned out, Don Krieg was completely inept, to the point where he could barely even walk in a straight line and kept bumping into things. After a rather painful journey, they finally got back to the red door. Don held the keycard in place, and Brian went through to see what spaceship parts he could scavenge. An empty canister. That didn't seem incredibly useful, but he was sure it would come in handy for something. Anyway, with the canister in his pocket, time was of the essence. They now had to reach the UFO before Officer noticed anything was missing, but for God's sake, Don, stop walking into the walls. It's really not that hard, just go in a straight line. As he was bumping into things, Don Krieg managed to pick up various electrical items along the way, such as an energy module and a radio receiver. Eventually, out of sheer perseverance, he managed to find his way to the generator room, whilst Brian dashed around the outside and pulled out his trusty fence cutters. As soon as the power went out, he got to work, snipping away piece by piece. There was a reason one of his many nicknames from back in the day was Brian Scissorhands, and it wasn't just because he was a big fan of the movie Edward Scissorhands. Just as Don fumbled his way outside to join him, Brian sheared his way through the final fence. He chucked all of the random electrical equipment into the spaceship along with the empty canister from earlier. And, would you believe it, against all the odds, the UFO whirred into life. The two of them hurried inside as the spaceship beeped and booped, beginning to float gracefully up into the air. They hovered high above Area 17, and Brian felt a great sense of triumph. "Engaging warp speed," he cried. The UFO disappeared in a flash. He and Don were going somewhere nobody could catch them. Up and away, into the great beyond of space. Unfortunately, a few days later, Brian was arrested by the space police after refusing to pay a speeding ticket. What, it wasn't his fault he didn't know you shouldn't use warp speed in a 30-mile-an-hour zone? Giant Brian, a criminal so despicable they sent him to prison in space. Having been caught speeding in his UFO, Brian and his sidekick Don Krieg had been sentenced to 15 years in the USS Anomaly, an interstellar prison specifically designed to hold felons too dangerous to be kept on Earth. With nothing but stars and the cold, dark vacuum of space surrounding him, Brian was just about the furthest he had ever been from freedom. But not even artificial gravity was going to keep him down. Brian was going to escape. As he woke up on his first day in orbit, Brian took in his surroundings. Kind of ironic how he was in space, and yet his room wasn't very spacious at all, thought Brian. But on a more concerning note, once he was finished laughing at his own joke, Brian noticed that every single room in this prison, including his own, was under constant 24-hour surveillance. Cameras in every room. And, what's more, the entire space station was patrolled by a convoy of robot guards, controlled centrally by some sort of sinister AI system. With computers watching his every move, he had next to no chance of escaping. He desperately needed to find somewhere more private, and, after searching around the space station's labyrinthine corridors, he eventually reached a set of stairs, up which finally was a room with no cameras. As there was no security in this part of the prison, Brian suspected he wouldn't find anything of particular interest, but wait a minute, those were escape pods! Of course! It was perfect! What better way to escape a space prison than in an escape pod? Well, this had all turned out so simple. Brian just had to open this door and he would be out of here in no time, but Brian, we've been through this. You can't be holding the door open and go through it at the same time. That's not how it works. It seemed Brian would need to find an accomplice. How about his fellow inmate Desmond? But apparently Desmond was far too busy forming a band. Maybe Dr. Goopy then? No, there was something he just didn't trust about Dr. Goopy, especially once he started beating him over the head with a broom handle. Brian refused to work with a sidekick that was constantly giving him mild head trauma. How about Ophelia? She seemed nice. But Ophelia's second name was Balls, and if Brian was going to be known as the world's greatest escapist, he did not want to be associated with someone named Ophelia Balls. With his options running out, it seemed that, oh god, he was going to have to escape with Don Krieg again. Don Krieg was an infamous criminal just like Brian, but he had a really annoying habit of walking into walls that meant he was far from the ideal sidekick. Despite this, Brian and Don fumbled their way back upstairs, and, working together, in no time they had reached the escape pods. This was it, the moment of truth, but there were a few major problems. As it turned out, these escape pods had been decommissioned quite some time ago. As such, they had no oxygen and no power. This was a problem as it meant if they boarded the escape pods now, they wouldn't be able to breathe or move. Two things they very much wanted to do. Brian's new mission then was to find an oxygen tank. And, if his theory was correct, for this, he would need to head to the medical bay. Taking his clothes off, Brian deliberately started a fight with the nearest robot guards. This way, not only did they take him straight to hospital, but once they did so, he was given a spare set of prison clothing. Then, after heading to the library and reading a book called Prison Fashion 101, How to Look Sexy in the Cell, he learnt that by combining his spare uniform with a pot of bleach, he could make himself a rather uncanny nurse's outfit. With this, he was able to enter the back rooms of the hospital without anyone batting an eye. And, as he opened the medical chest, he found a whole load of nothing. There was no oxygen tanks in here at all. Instead, there was just a single banana. Brian headed back to his room disappointed. That was so strange. He could have sworn he was onto something, but excuse me, Quasi Quaver. I'm sort of in the middle of something here. Oh my god, he's on top of the desk. Guards! Guards! But seeing as this was Brian's room, when the guards arrived, they attacked him instead. And although he was able to steal a cool new robot outfit during his fight, he was then placed in solitary confinement. By the time Brian had been set free, Quasi Quaver was acting even more quasi. Now that's the look of a man who's had far too much oxygen, thought Brian. And, lo and behold, when he searched through Quasi Quaver's desk the next day, there it was, an oxygen tank. Now, all Brian needed to escape was some form of power source. Oh, hang on, literally everything in this prison was run by robots. so Brian set about beating up every robot he could find. Surely at least a couple of them ran on AA batteries or something. After punching his way through quite a lot of candidates, some powered by cables, some by solar panels, and some by just pure jealousy, Brian did eventually come into the possession of a couple of batteries. And, combining them together to make an energy module, it was time to blow this space popsicle stand. Reconvening with Don Krieg, who I'd just like to point out had done none of the work up to this point, they hauled themselves back past the large metal doors and into the escape pod bay. Then, fixing up their capsule as fast as possible, they bundled inside and launched themselves out into the great beyond. They had done it! Brian and Don were heading back to Earth as free men. Although, this thing was going pretty slow, so it was probably going to take them a while, and speaking of which, shouldn't they be in a bit more of a hurry considering they'd just broken out of prison? Oh god, no! The robot guards had caught up to them, using Brian's very own UFO! Curse you, space rozzers! You'll never take me alive! In a flash, Brian was beamed back into his cell. Oh crumbs, why could it never just be simple? Seeing as the space police had commandeered his UFO, which to be fair he stole in the first place, Brian was going to have to find something much faster than what was essentially a tin of beans with an engine on the back. Having explored most of the prison at this point though, his only real option was to venture off limits. After scouting around for some time, he made his way to the upper floors and decided to start by snipping his way through an area that was mysteriously fenced off. There must have been a reason this area was so restricted, and just as he broke through to the other side, he found it. Parked at the very top of the station was a space shuttle. Brian could tell just by looking at it that this thing was fast. Those tiny wings, that aerodynamic square design, this was the vehicle he'd been looking for. The only issue now was how to get to it. Running back to his cell, he picked up a screwdriver and then returned to the scene at breakneck pace. Unfastening the vent cover in front of him, he snuck inside and began to snip away at the blockades in place. He would have informed Don Krieg about this plan, but to be honest, Don had a tough time walking through hallways, let alone crawling through vents. Unfortunately, this particular ventilation shaft was so blocked up that before Brian could make his way to the other side, he had missed roll call and the prison was sent into lockdown. There was now no time to lose. Brian snipped with all his might, but oh god, what were those? Some sort of robot dogs? Oh god, this wasn't good! And Brian was knocked unconscious. Okay, Giant Brian wasn't against technology, but this was ridiculous. Robot dogs? What was next? Robot guinea pigs? Anyway, how did they even find him? It must be that insufferable AI. Brian wasn't going to be getting anywhere unless he found a way to shut the whole computer system down. First things first though, he wanted to get his stuff back, and just to prove that he could do it, Brian found another ventilation shaft, crawled through it, and then dropped down on the other side into the contraband room. Although only some of his stuff was there, what he didn't expect to find was a jetpack. And it was with this that Giant Brian's giant brain kicked into gear. Using his incredible mind palace, he scanned his mental map and studied the prison layout. If he remembered correctly, on the far left side of the station was a pair of red staff doors leading to a room marked by bright orange danger signs. The plan was simple: get in that room, cause chaos, shut the whole space prison down, and then jetpack the ever-loving shizzle out of there. Brian wondered where he could track down a red key. Oh look, here comes someone now. Maybe they have it. I mean, I know it's unlikely because it's the first officer we've come across and there's God knows how many officers in here, but there was the red key! Using a moldable putty, Brian crafted a spare key as quickly as possible. Then he returned to the danger signs and headed through the red doors. Brian didn't fear danger, he was the danger. Although even he had to admit this place was a little bit creepy. Before him sat a huge supercomputer, the mastermind of this whole dystopian facility. But Brian would be manipulated no more. He was no computer scientist, but he did know one thing for sure. There was a big green button on the wall in front of him. A button which probably meant power down. Oh, no, wait, it actually just deactivated the artificial gravity. Oh well, serves the same purpose. With his jetpack strapped tightly to his back, Brian hovered his way past the helpless floating robot guards. This time they could do nothing to stop him, as he boarded the space shuttle, started the engine, and and set full thrusters back to planet Earth. Unfortunately, in the time he had been away from Earth, the entire world had become a military dictatorship. Oh my god, Brian just couldn't catch a break, could he? Giant Brian, the world's most conniving criminal, best known for escaping prisons of all shapes and sizes. He'd escape prisons in the desert, prisons out at sea, prisons on wheels, prisons on wings, and even a prison in space. But in the most unforeseen of twists, this dangerous convict was now the planet's only hope, as half of the entire world suffered under a new military dictatorship. The People's Republic of Tesco. Despite its name, this republic was not for the people at all. Instead, it served one person and one person only. The brainwashed masses worshipped a man named the Glorious Leader, but he was merely a puppet. Behind the scenes, a much more sinister dictator ruled from the shadows, orchestrating evil whilst posing as no more than an innocent policewoman. Giant Brian's arch nemesis, Officer. Oh crumbs, Brian knew he shouldn't have stolen those Fredo Frogs from Tesco all that time ago, but there was no way of predicting it would eventually cause the military occupation of half of the Earth. Plus, he was quite literally out of orbit for most of it, so he decided to cut himself some slack. Best not to beat yourself up over these things. That aside, Brian was once again stuck in jail, and the idea of letting Officer get away with all this made his very blood boil. That was it. He was going to stop this rotten revolution in the only way he knew how. Brian was going to escape. Instead of finding an escape route himself though, Brian decided to enroll on the official Tesco compound tour. This way he could search for places to break out, whilst also learning about the prison's fascinating history. For example, this prison canteen used to serve bags of quavers, until one day their entire quaver stock mysteriously disappeared. Interesting. Quavers were Brian's favourite flavour of crisps. And the intrigue didn't stop there. This two-seater Apache helicopter wasn't the 1962 model, but in fact the newer, more streamlined 1967 model. Hang on, there was a helicopter here? Well, Giant Brian's escape plans had just got a whole load easier. With a military-grade helicopter on his side, preventing Officer's evil schemes would be no problem. And, in high spirits, Brian launched into action. His first move was to get himself some climbing gear, but to do this he would need some help. So Brian enlisted the services of his fellow inmate, No Face. Brian was usually a solo escape artist, but this situation was perfect, as nobody would remember a man with no face, so Brian could still claim all of the credit. With No Face's help, he was able to sneak past a large metal door into the storage room behind, in which was a chest containing a crowbar. Just what he was searching for. But just as soon as he retrieved this item, No Face disappeared in a puff of smoke. What a mysterious guy. Oh well, he had served his purpose, and all Brian needed now was a rope. After performing several favours for other prisoners, such as delivering talcum powder for Salmon Face or fetching a lump of sugar for Pastrami Pam, he was able to buy one from the local dealer. And with this, he crafted his very own grappling hook. It was time to grapple, and grapple hard. Sprinting past all of the dumb schmucks at roll call, Brian found himself the perfect location, then climbing the walls using his incredible upper body strength. His new grappling hook was working a charm. He would arrive at that helicopter in no time, but oh bollocks. This was just typical. As usual, his destination was blocked off by a red staff door. Brian tried to find his way around this predicament, but having clambered too high up, he was spotted by a prison sniper, then resulting in a long and thrilling chase scene involving him and about 20 million officers. Of course, rumour had it Brian was so fast he could walk on water, and despite the fact this was a rumour he made up during his Messiah complex phase, he was able to outrun his captors, then waiting out the heat in a filing cabinet. Well, as was tradition at this point, Brian was going to need to acquire a red key. Thankfully, with his great wealth of prison experience, he knew exactly where to find one. Officer, your days are numbered. Wait, what? But Officer always had the red key. Uh-oh, Brian had just taken out the chief of police for no reason at all. And here comes backup. You'll never take me alive, Officer Borlake, shouted Brian. But hold up, happy days! There it was, the red key! Hurrying back to his room, Brian crafted a duplicate as quickly as possible. Then, with all his items in check, he set off on escape attempt number 2. Scaling the walls with his hook once more, this time Brian slipped straight through the red door and up the stairs to the helipad. Here we go, it was time to cause some chaos. But then Brian remembered something very important they had told him on his prison tour. This was a 2-person helicopter. He couldn't fly this thing on his own. If only No-Face hadn't performed ninjutsu and disappeared into a puff of smoke. Escape postponed again. He was gonna have to find a new accomplice. And so, sneaking back downstairs, Brian infiltrated the surveillance room and began to study the security footage in the hopes he could find a worthy sidekick. As he sat there, however, his attention was drawn to one screen in particular. An old dusty monitor which read, "Special Case Study, detained in maximum security at Fort Tundra." Change of plans then. It seemed Brian would be transferring prisons. Fort Tundra, here we come. Before he could head north, however, he needed to find a way to ditch this totalitarian dump. Thankfully, Brian had a genius idea, so he ran headfirst into an electric fence, his hope being that he was so badly injured they would have to take him out of prison in an emergency ambulance. Unfortunately, thanks to an accident working at a previous job in a Wellington boot factory, Brian's body was made of 30% rubber, just enough for him to survive with no lasting damage. It seemed he would have to go even more extreme. Brian was going to have to die. Making himself a fake nurse's uniform and sneaking into the medical room, he stole some blocks of ice. The theory being he could create a device that would make him so cold, it slowed his pulse to the point where he appeared to be dead. This got the doctor's attention, and before he knew it, they were dumping him into a body bag and shipping him, unknowingly, to freedom. But in the midst of this, it dawned on Brian that if he kept the act up for too long, he might end up being buried alive. So, making a rather sudden and extraordinary recovery, he jumped out the back of the ambulance and escaped before the doctors had time to realise he wasn't quite the medical miracle they had just witnessed. To remain undetected on his extensive journey north, Brian decided to swim the majority of the way, resulting in a minor case of hypothermia, but nothing Brian couldn't handle, and oh look who's decided to follow along. Of course No-Face turns up now that we don't need him anymore. Trudging his way through the snowy forests, all that remained was to break back into prison. This felt wrong, but Brian would just have to suck it up. And, using his infamous diggy diggy hole method, getting inside of Fort Tundra was a piece of cake. But Brian had a sneaking suspicion this tunnel would only work once, for this prison was nothing to be sniffed at. The extreme Siberian conditions chilled inmates and officers alike to their very core. In spite of this, Brian knew it would all be worth it when he found out just who this special case study was. Oh, hang on. Oh no. No. It was Don Krieg again. Don had been Brian's partner in crime during 2 of his previous escapes. However, Brian had to leave Don in space as he was, to put it kindly, completely inept. As it turned out, Don had managed to return from space by asking for a snow cone as his death row final meal. Hence he had been re-sanctioned here. Oh dear, death row? Sure, Brian found Don's habit of walking into walls infuriating, but even he didn't want to see his good friend kick the bucket. So, together they sat down at the breakfast table and devised an ingenious plan. First, Brian would beat up 3 guards all on his own, then making 2 copies of the red key, whilst Don would sit here and stay out of trouble. Then, Brian would scavenge for materials and fashion a pickaxe using nothing but wood and duct tape, whilst Don would sit here and stay out of trouble. Finally, the 2 of them would make their way to the far east of the compound, where they would sneak past a warehouse door, mine through the frozen walls, and steal the off-road jeep that sat idle on the other side. With Brian having failed his driving theory test a record 457 times, Don Krieg insisted on driving. This was a bad idea. But after a minor collision, they set off back towards the Tesco compound, ready and raring for a grand showdown. Upon reaching the site, Brian and Don snuck past the guards, making no more sound than a passing breeze. Well, that is until Brian decided to do some showboating and began to breakdance in the middle of the road. With Officer watching on, this was a declaration of war. She had haunted the lives of Brian and so many others for too long. With every body pop, every flourishing spin, he made his point heard. No matter how many strings she pulled behind the scenes, Giant Brian refused to be tied down. They were back inside, and, provoking a little round 2 from Officer Ballake, Brian stole what he hoped would be the last red key he would ever need. The only issue now was that Brian didn't know how to fly a helicopter, and having seen Don drive a car, well, best not to take the risk. Therefore, they would have to find some way to coax one of the guards into flying it for them, and to achieve this, they would need Anne Gunn. Oh, there she was, just the woman they were searching for. Anne was an old companion of Brian's. She used to work as a driving theory instructor, but those days were behind her, and she now held down a job as a weaponsmith. Combining some wax, a piece of soap and a dinner tray, she then painted it with a jar of ink, and a fake gun was created. Brian felt safer using a fake gun, as it meant the documentary he was planning to make afterwards wouldn't get demonetized. With that, everything was in place. The time was now. Side by side, Brian and Don grappled up the walls of the compound, back onto the roof, and then through the red door and up the stairs to the helipad on the top floor. Just in time, they hurled themselves inside the helicopter, using the plastic gun to force the pilot to take off. Despite her henchman's pathetic struggles, all Officer could do was stare upwards in awe as her master plan went up in smoke. Brian and Don were going to liberate everyone, and the collective cheers of prisoners all across the People's Republic of Tesco were easily loud enough to reach them high up in the sky. Brian thought back. He had come such a long way since digging through walls with plastic spoons in Centre Perks. Freedom, this time true freedom, beckoned. But first, more important matters. "Take us to the nearest corner shop," shouted Brian. "I'm going to steal some Fredo Frogs."